For the next 90 minutes, you'll see Korea the way the soldiers saw it, in full, shocking color. This is a true picture of the war, full of terror, chaos, blood, and courage. Much of it has never been seen by the general public until now. This is Korea, the first great confrontation of the Cold War. In the spring of 1950, just 2 months before tensions between North and South Korea boiled over into war, a South Korean military photographer captured a mass execution on film. It is gruesome evidence of the simmering feud that would tear the Korean peninsula apart. These North Koreans were captured while spying on the South. These dead, once fellow countrymen, are now enemies to South Korea. The tensions between North and South, born in the wake of World War II, have reached the boiling point. Korea, called the land of the morning calm, is really a harsh land of jagged ridges, fickle weather, and a checkered past. The peninsula lies 6,000 miles east of the United States, in a remote corner of the Asian North Pacific. Sitting precariously between Russia, China, and Japan, Korea was always at the mercy of its bigger neighbors. For centuries, foreign conquerors trampled over Korean soil to do battle with each other. As World War II came to a close, the peninsula was up for grabs after decades of Japanese rule. In July of 1945, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin joined forces with the United States to pinch the Japanese out of Korea with a two-prong attack from north and south. The superpowers met at the 38th parallel, the line of latitude running through the middle of the peninsula. They agreed to split and occupy Korea along that line. The Soviets would control the northern half, while the U.S. took the southern half, each set to work honing a government modeled in its own image. When the superpowers pulled out in 1947, they left behind two starkly different regimes. In the north, zealous puppets of communist Russia and China took control. In the south, a Princeton-educated autocrat named Syngman Rhee emerged. Both sides wanted the other eliminated. Threats grew stronger, spies more numerous, and violence more prevalent along the border. This little peninsula wasn't big enough for both of them. The question was, who would draw first blood? At 4 a.m. on June 25, 1950, the armies of North Korea stormed across the 38th parallel, hoping to crush the South in one overwhelming offensive. 135,000 communists besieged a ragtag South Korean border patrol and steamrolled southward. At outposts all along the border, South Koreans and their American military advisors were overrun, caught completely off guard. The U.S. had deprived South Korea of weapons and ammunition, thinking it might invade the North and start a war. Syngman Rhee, the South's fiery and aggressive leader, had threatened to do so. All that held him back was a lack of firepower. Now, the U.S. strategy of restraint had backfired. The South was on the receiving end, with nothing to defend itself against the communist tanks and heavy artillery. In just 2 days, Seoul, the South Korean capital lying 30 miles below the parallel, was captured by the North. Terrified South Koreans rushed to escape the city. Roads leading south over the Han River were jammed with refugees and truckloads of equipment. But in fear of the communist advance, Southern officials ordered the bridges destroyed. When they exploded, hundreds of refugees were still struggling to cross. Nearly all of them perished. Thousands more were cut off from escape. News of Seoul's collapse spread quickly through the countryside. Overnight, panic permeated the southern peninsula. North Korea hoped the U.S. would look the other way and let the South be taken. But the American home front was being whipped into a frenzy over communist aggression. If South Korea fell to the Reds, would Japan be next? Sensing public outrage, President Harry Truman immediately called for U.S. air and sea strikes against North Korean targets.
Korea is a small country, thousands of miles away, but what is happening there is important to every American. An act of aggression such as this creates a very real danger to the security of all free nations. This is a direct challenge to the efforts of free nations to build the kind of world in which men can live in freedom and peace. This challenge has been presented squarely. We must meet it squarely.
American jets went right to work, shooting down 6 North Korean fighter planes on their first day in action. The Navy bombarded the enemy coastline from the sea. But the communists owned the land, and they pushed on virtually unfazed. There was speculation that the U.S. would use the atom bomb as it had on Japan, but Russia had deployed one successfully the previous summer, presenting a dangerous new threat. Dropping the bomb now would risk Armageddon, so it was clear to U.S. commanders that this war would have to be fought from the trenches. Truman called on the United Nations to lead a police action against North Korea.
The prompt action of the United Nations to put down lawless aggression and the prompt response to this action by free peoples all over the world will stand as a landmark in mankind's long search for a rule of law among nations.
United States forces would be the backbone of the operation, but the force of the U.S. military in 1950 was dangerously weak. Its budget was 1/10 what it had been in 1945, and combat troops in the Far East were few and far between. What strength was left was thousands of miles away, bolstering NATO forces against the Warsaw Pact nations in Eastern Europe. Douglas MacArthur, the commander-in-chief of Far East forces and a legendary World War II general, would face a great challenge as leader of operations. A supremely confident man with a larger-than-life presence, MacArthur was the face of America to the Asian world. His cherished military legacy would be put to the test in Korea. The 1st Brigade to reach the front was Task Force Smith. Its reports confirmed the dangers that lay ahead. In early July, the brigade ran into a column of North Koreans 30 miles below Seoul. Waiting in a cluster of hills, the force hid motionless until the enemy was upon them, and then let loose with everything they had. But the northern tanks were undeterred. Task Force Smith only knocked out 4, and the other 33 rolled right through its lines. For the first of many times in the war, the Americans were trapped behind the enemy and had to fight their way out.
Guys fell around me as mortar rounds zeroed in on us. One of my young guys got it in the middle. Oh, Jesus, the guy was moaning and groaning. There wasn't much I could do but pat him on the head and say, "Hang in there." Lieutenant Philip Day, Jr., Task Force Smith.
It quickly became clear that this was no police action. This was war, and unless support arrived in a hurry, it would be a short one. Troops from the U.S. 8th Army arrived from Japan over the next few weeks, but they were trying to stop a flood with their hands. The North Koreans were pushing steadily south toward Pusan, and UN troops faced a real possibility of being driven into the sea. The first American strategy was to dig in along the front and set up blockades. But time and again, the North Koreans would move around them and block from the rear. Unit after unit was trapped in enemy territory. By July 20th, only a small corner of South Korea was left to conquer. The United Nations was losing the race against time. By August 1950, the U.S. 8th Army had its back against a wall. It had been pushed to within 65 miles of Pusan and Korea's southern shore. The last real natural barrier before Pusan was the Naktung River. A strong stand there would be crucial. But the UN line was dangerously shaky. A division of 3,600 men can comfortably defend a front the length of 100 football fields. But along the Naktung, single battalions of 400 men were covering 150 football fields. Compounding the manpower shortage was a phenomenon known as the bug out. In 6 short weeks, these men had gone from relaxing peacetime duties to the carnage of the front lines. Thousands had nervous breakdowns. This infuriated General Walton Walker, the field commander of the 8th Army, who reported directly to General MacArthur. Walker had been one of Patton's corps commanders in World War II. He was a no-nonsense Texan who didn't mince words. On July 29th, he issued a stand-or-die order. He told his subordinates, "If I ever see you back here again, it had better be in a coffin." Walker's troops faced hostility no matter which way they turned. They had to rely on their only advantage, firepower, to keep them alive. Along the southwest shore of the perimeter, U.S. Marines headed off a hard communist charge. Overhead, Marine corsairs tore up the enemy line, destroying vehicles and supply lines. But north of there, a U.S. Army battalion was being ripped apart. North Korean tanks rushed down from the hills and launched a concentrated attack from point-blank range. The Americans lost all of their equipment, suffered 160 casualties, and were quickly overrun. The battleground was nicknamed Bloody Gulch. Further upstream, the Communists found a gap in the UN line and exploited it. During the night, they crossed the Naktung and easily captured No Name Ridge. The ridge ran straight south toward Pusan, and unless the North Koreans were driven back quickly, the whole perimeter could fall. The Americans struck back hard. For 2 weeks, the battle raged on. The same hills were won and lost dozens of times. Punch-drunk infantrymen fought with everything they had. Air attacks rained down on the Communists.
After the firefight, the American airstrikes hit the North Koreans on either side of the river. The North Koreans were screaming. We heard them, and we were a mile or more away. Floyd Atkins, B Company.
The river line was eventually restored, and the North Koreans fell back to lick their wounds. The red tide had been halted for the first time. By mid-August, the United Nations had built up enough manpower to level the playing field. Units arrived through the port of Pusan from nations as diverse as France, Turkey, Thailand, and Ethiopia. The British Commonwealth forces, drawing men from Great Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, were also important contributors. Most of these men were too young for World War II. They were eager to make their own mark on this new battlefield, but few of them could comprehend the harsh realities of war that awaited them. American troops in particular showed a brash confidence coming off the boat.
Busan was like being in a college town on homecoming Saturday. The kids were terrific. They didn't walk off the dock, they swaggered off. Their attitude said, "Don't worry about it, the Marines are here." Second Lieutenant Tom Gibson.
Among those arriving were thousands of black recruits. Unlike their predecessors in previous wars, they would serve in mixed units, fighting alongside white troops for the first time. And while most branches of the military still practiced segregation in 1950, the demand for fresh soldiers was immediate, and units were filled on a first-come, first-sent basis, regardless of race. Mixed units cooperated well on the hills of Korea, whether in the midst of combat or campfire sing-alongs. But on September 1st, 1950, all attention turned to the enemy, who launched a final offensive all around the wall of the perimeter. The Communists limped forward with exhausted men and a broken supply line, but they were fought out and couldn't sustain the drive. Now they were losing the race against time. The moment was right for the United Nations to strike back, and General MacArthur knew just where to do it. For weeks, General MacArthur had been eyeing the port at Incheon for a counterstrike. Incheon was nestled along the shores of the Yellow Sea. It was the closest port to Seoul and a major supply center. But it was deep in enemy territory and laden with natural obstacles, such as the 33-foot shift between high and low tide, the largest in the world. To make matters worse, Air Force flyovers revealed that the islands in the harbor were guarded by North Korean troops. The hazards were tremendous. Naval commanders protested the plan, but MacArthur was adamant. He sent a telegram to the Pentagon on September 6th that read, "There is no question in my mind as to the feasibility of the operation, and I regard its chance of success as excellent. I go further and believe that it represents the only hope of wresting the initiative from the enemy and thereby presenting the opportunity for a decisive blow." The loss of Incheon would be an immense psychological defeat for the North Koreans. Conversely, control of Incheon would give UN forces a tremendous boost in position and morale. It offered a secure beachhead from which to launch attacks on Kimpo Airfield and Seoul, 25 miles away. But the operation called for amphibious teams to land on a small beach, scale a seawall, and attack directly into a city. It would require soldiers of unparalleled bravery. MacArthur created a special 10th Corps to carry out the operation. Divisions from the Army, Marines, and Navy were pulled from the action around Busan to lead the charge. As the soldiers set sail for Incheon, they reflected on what lay ahead.
As soon as we pulled out of Busan, we began to get the briefings on the tide situation in the Incheon harbor area. None of us ever had any experience operating under such tidal conditions before, let alone ever having been involved in an amphibious landing. As soon as the morning of September 15th approached, we realized that we had all the ingredients for disaster on our hands. Ensign George Gilman, USS Mount McKinley.
The invasion strategy was as complicated as its target. Incheon's harbor was too shallow at low tide for large ships to maneuver. So MacArthur decided to invade in 2 phases, synchronized with the high tides. Wolmi-do, the main island at the entrance to the harbor, would be assaulted with the first tide in the morning. The main event would follow with the second tide at night. 5 days in advance of the operation, Marine jets began blanketing Wolmy-Do with bombs. Two days before, surface ships joined in. And so it was on the morning of September 15, 1950, the 10th Corps moved in on burned-out Wolmy-Do. The North Koreans had been caught off guard and gave up the island easily, suffering more than 300 casualties in the process. Only 20 American troops were injured. None were killed. For the next 11 hours, the 10th Corps Infantry waited for the tide to roll back. While they rested, 230 vessels moved in, and Marine corsairs ravaged the city of Incheon. Troops on Wolmy-Do watched the air assault unfold. Reporter Jack Siegel was there to record the reaction.
Yeah, what do you think of those Marine corsairs? Those Marine corsairs are pretty swell things to have around. Here comes another one of them down on the other side of that hill. Now, there go two rockets. Look at that man. He went right down over the rim of the hill. He's over on his side, now coming directly over it.
As the evening approached, the 10th Corps unleashed the main thrust of the invasion. The landing targets were Red Beach, near the heart of the city, and Blue Beach to the south. Heavy naval and air bombardment cleared the path ahead of them. Landing ships made their way to the shore. Tanks and heavy equipment were unloaded onto the beaches. Infantrymen prepared to infiltrate the city on foot. Red Beach was secured within an hour and a half, and troops entered the streets of the city on the lookout for snipers. The following morning, Red Beach and Blue Beach were linked, and the operation was complete. Amazingly, the invasion was executed with such precision that only 20 UN soldiers were killed. MacArthur's gamble was a rousing success, and no one was more delighted than the great general. But his thoughts quickly turned to the real prize that lay just over the horizon. The loss of Incheon put the North Koreans still fighting south of there in deep trouble. The UN invasion was completely unexpected, and most of the Red Army was still fighting in the Pusan perimeter area, 130 miles south. Communist troops there were never informed of the defeat at Incheon. They fought on for a week afterward, unaware that they were in danger of being cut off. But when word of Incheon finally trickled down to the perimeter, they fled northward almost immediately. Meanwhile, the 10th Corps marched northeast from Incheon on the road to Seoul. They were battle-ready and let nothing stand in their way. The first target inland was Kimpo Airfield. As the closest major airstrip to Seoul, its value was immeasurable. Kimpo fell easily to the Marines on September 18th. Within 2 days, Marine corsairs were launching airstrikes on Seoul from there. Kimpo would play a key role in conquering the city. The 10th Corps had a three-pronged plan. The 5th Marines would cross the Han River directly north of Kimpo, and then swing east and attack the city's western flank. Meanwhile, the 1st Marines would capture the suburbs just south of Seoul, and then join the 5th Marines to attack the city's west side. Finally, the Army 7th Division would rush up from the Pusan perimeter and cut off North Korean reinforcements on the eastern side. The Marines crossed the Han as planned, but hit strong resistance in the hills west of Seoul. Heavy fighting took its toll on the Marines. The North Koreans were dug in deep and stuck to the hills like glue. Tank fire and air support rained down on the Communists for 3 days. Even flamethrowers couldn't loosen their hold. The battle came down to the last man, almost literally. On a crucial ridge known as Hill 66, Marines made a final push for control. The last men standing charged heroically with their bayonets and pried the Communists from their foxholes. When the smoke cleared, just 33 of the company's 206 Marines stood to savor the victory. Southeast of the city, the Army 7th Infantry was blazing a trail, advancing north like a steam train. On September 22nd, it beat back an enemy tank battalion and captured another airfield at Suwon, 20 miles southeast of Seoul. Air missions from Suwon and Kimpo against Seoul helped clear the way for the soldiers below. By September 24th, UN troops held the high ground around the capital.
I'll never forget the sight I saw. Down below was a very big city. Smoke was coming from everywhere. Buildings and houses were on fire. You could see the Corsairs dive down from the sky, then swoop back up, leaving a puff of black smoke and a dull explosion. From the top of that hill, it looked like I was watching a movie right before my eyes. Except that it was for real. John Bishop, Private First Class.
The next day, the North Koreans fled the city. American soldiers rushed down from the hills in triumph. Seoul, the economic and cultural center of Korea, was back in friendly hands. On September 29, 1950, dignitaries flew into Kimpo and made their way to Seoul for a celebration. It was full of pomp and pageantry. The United Nations wanted the world to know that their police action was well in hand. But snipers could still be heard in the distance during the ceremony, an audible reminder of the dangers still lurking on the horizon. In September of 1950, the momentum was shifting dramatically in favor of the United Nations. The 8th Army was pushing northward at a pace that recalled Patton's drive across France after Normandy. The first objective was to reach the 38th parallel, where the war began, to reclaim South Korea's old borders. South Korean divisions led the charge, reaching the parallel on October 1st. They kept moving right into North Korea. A week later, American forces were perched at the parallel, anxiously waiting for orders to follow suit. But back in Washington, tough choices had to be made. Should the United Nations continue the drive into North Korean soil? Would this overstep the mandate of a police action? There were no easy answers. U.S. commanders heard rumors that Communist China was moving large numbers of troops north into Manchuria. The Chinese resented American intervention in the region and feared that hostilities would spill over into their Manchurian territory. Intelligence reports estimated that up to 450,000 Chinese troops were lurking in the hills beyond the Yalu River, poised to strike. But these warning signs were cast aside by Americans thirsting for an unconditional victory. After the World Wars, anything less would be a disappointment. Korea didn't affect the everyday lives of most Americans as previous wars had. 1950s America was a pleasant, peaceful place where there was a car in every garage and a drive-in diner in every town. Stories of the triumphs in Korea were an exciting diversion from the humdrum every day, and as the Eighth Army marched heroically onto North Korean soil, a bored, communist-hating populace watched with attentive glee. As the fighting moved north, the citizens of South Korea tried to resume their daily lives. Weddings, funerals, and the daily market went on as they had before the war. As they recovered from the destruction of the previous 4 months, they waited anxiously for their leader, Syngman Rhee, to deliver on his long-held promise to unite the peninsula. After centuries of subjugation, the Korean people were anxious to control their own destiny. Whether at the mercy of the Mongols, Chinese, Manchus, Russians, or Japanese, South Koreans were always in the shadow, and often under the command of foreign invaders. They were most influenced by the Chinese, who ruled the peninsula on and off for more than 1,000 years. The cultures of the two countries, each centered around Buddhism and agriculture, were closely linked. But the politics of the two were worlds apart in 1950. South Koreans rejected the Chinese communism that threatened to devour their homeland. Within weeks, their sons would meet their nemesis head-on in the hills of North Korea. There, the front was opening up. The road to Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, was free and clear, and UN battalions raced each other to it. The North Koreans tried to establish a thin defensive line around their capital, but they couldn't curtail the UN momentum. The Eighth Army found itself at the gates of Pyongyang within 10 days of crossing the parallel. Looking at the open road ahead, the men couldn't help being optimistic.
General MacArthur announced that we would be home by Thanksgiving. We believed him. Life seemed good in Pyongyang. Morale was sky high. James Cardinal, Private First Class.
The Eighth Army set out north and west from Pyongyang, eager to vanquish the northern regime. As they crossed the Changchan River, the last major land barrier in North Korea, they could smell victory waiting for them on the other side. But what they found was a mass grave holding over 100 executed American prisoners. The North Koreans were turning even more savage in their desperation. UN resolve was renewed. On October 24th, General MacArthur ordered his men to march straight to the Yalu River. Now he would let nothing stand in the way of total victory.